Good evening and welcome to episode 12 of Geostrategy with me, your host AbhijitChavda. I hope everybody is doing great. Today we're going to discuss what's happened in the past week. What are the important things that we need to keep an eye on in the world? What is the direction that the world is going in? And what are the forces that are impelling change worldwide and motivating the key drivers of change? So let us discuss all of that. Just for your information, this show is best viewed on a large screen. If you are trying to watch it on a small screen, it won't be that great because I have a presentation that I will show you and it has text on it. So ideally you would want to watch this if you're serious about geostrategy, geopolitics. You would want to watch this on a large screen. And also please note, this is not a Q&A show. I will take your questions tomorrow during the next episode of Ask Abhijit. So let us get going with what's happened since the last time we did geostrategy. Let's take a look at what have been the most impactful developments in the past week or so. So what has it been? There's been a lot of developments in the world. Let's take a look at a few of these. Let's begin with the global trade war that the Trump administration has launched. So the July 9 deadline has come and gone, and now the Trump administration has launched the next phase, let's say, of the global trade war with sweeping tariffs against a variety of nations. They have announced sweeping new tariffs ranging from 10% to 70% on at least 14 countries. And this includes America's key Asian, let's say, allies, Japan and South Korea. These two nations are facing 25% tariffs. The policy also targets Brazil with a politically motivated 50% tariff. And Trump is threatening a 10% tariff on every nation that's part of BRICS. So why does this matter? Why is this an important development? So this is a fundamental shift in US trade policy. This is an aggressive shift in US trade policy. It's moving, the US approach is now moving beyond a China-centric trade war. It's now a global pressure campaign. And the use of tariffs to target key security assets like Japan and South Korea, and the use of these tariffs to influence domestic politics of nations like Brazil, which are again US assets or allies. This policy of doing all of this, it risks fracturing strategic alliances that the US has built up over decades. Right, and this could accelerate the fragmentation of the global economy into competing blocks, not just two blocks, not just a bipolar world, but a multipolar world. Right, and this could prompt widespread retaliatory measures by various nations against the United States. So this strategy that Donald Trump's administration is employing, it's causing significant market volatility worldwide. It's forcing a very rapid and very visible restructuring of global supply chains. So there's been these tariffs, 10% to 70%. There's 50% tariff on all Brazilian imports. At least 14 countries have been targeted thus far. It's just beginning right now, it looks like. Yep. Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, the BRICS nations. And now there's a new deadline. There's a new deadline of August 1, 2025. Which has been set for these four nations to negotiate new trade agreements. Now, what about India? We're going to discuss India. I promise you, we're going to discuss India, and we're going to have a separate section about how India is dealing with the Trump trade war against the world. So the forecast that I have is that multiple nations will have no option but to announce retaliatory tariffs against the US within the next 14 days, most likely. And at the same time, they will seek exemptions through accelerated bilateral negotiations with the United States. So the EU is adopting a robust retaliatory stance. The EU is pushing for a quick trade deal to avoid being targeted. France and the UK have signaled a desire to reduce their economic dependency and other sorts of dependencies on the United States. The ASEAN nations have expressed unified concern against what's happening. They are moving to strengthen intra-regional, intra-block trade amongst each other. Japan and South Korea are scrambling to address the threats. They are accelerating, they are putting their differences aside and accelerating their own bilateral cooperation. and so much more. So that's our first major impactful development of the past week or so. What next do we have? We have Russia. We have the Ukraine war. And Russia has dramatically escalated the Ukraine war with record aerial assaults. So Russia launched its largest, I mean, it's almost like every week we are seeing this now, the largest ever attack. But Russia has launched its largest aerial assaults since the war began. They have fired over 700 drones and missiles in a single attack. And this massive attack was launched hours after a phone call between President Putin and President Trump. So this demonstrates that Russia is determined to escalate despite diplomatic engagement with the US. And all of this is coming in the middle of chemical weapons allegations. Dutch and German intelligence have alleged that Russia is using what they call banned chemical weapons to force Ukrainian troops away from their defensive positions. That's an allegation that the West has made against Russia. So all of this, why does it matter? So this represents a major escalation in Russian military strategy. They are combining overwhelming conventional force, which they have always had. They have been very restrained in using that, but now they are more willing to use it, overwhelming conventional force. And this comes in the middle of Western claims of violation of international law, which is the alleged use of chemical weapons. So these massive barrages, these massive missile and drone barrages attacks are designed to overwhelm Ukraine's air defenses. And this allegation of chemical weapons use, if it is true, I'm not saying it's true, if it is true, it signals a potential shift towards more extreme tactics to achieve Russian battlefield objectives. If it is true, it's an allegation. Okay, allegations are par for the course when it comes to any kind of conflict. And this escalation has occurred at a time when the US briefly paused its weapons shipments to Ukraine. And they opened diplomatic channels with Russia. So this tells us that Russia is using extreme force to improve its negotiating position and test American resolve. So this is how it's done. When you are negotiating with someone, you've got to have leverage. So you have to improve your negotiating position, and one way of doing it is by changing facts on the ground, on the battlefield. And you will see this. You must have seen this when China and India usually negotiate. Whenever Xi Jinping comes to India, he starts something on the border, right? That sort of thing. So we have this, and the timing of this assault, essentially right after the Trump-Putin call, it tells us that there was either a diplomatic failure when it comes to the phone call and the talks, or maybe this is a deliberate signaling of Russian resolve to the US. So this escalation is something that stretches American military resources across multiple theaters. So this has been a large-scale attack. Up to 741 drones and missiles were launched in a single day. And Russia has launched a new major offensive in the Sumy region with an estimated 50,000 troops. And most likely, Russia will continue these large-scale aerial attacks while advancing its ground operations. And the objective is to stretch Ukrainian defenses, crumble Ukrainian defenses, and exploit Western hesitation or perceptions of Western hesitations. So the US has resumed its weapons shipments to Ukraine after a brief pause, like we discussed. And Germany has promised additional air defense systems to Ukraine. And the EU is preparing its toughest sanctions yet on Russia, which, well, by now it's just performative. I think all the sanctions you can actually realistically deploy have been deployed. And there's a Chinese factor as well, which we will discuss briefly. I mean, imminently. We're going to discuss that imminently. What's the deal with China? So China has hardened its stance on the Ukraine conflict. And China has told the EU that China cannot accept a Russian defeat in Ukraine. So this was conveyed to the EU by the Chinese Foreign Minister, Wang Yi. He told EU representatives that China cannot accept Russia losing this war against Ukraine. So this represents China's most direct challenge to EU policy on the conflict, and it's a significant hardening of China's public position from its previous claims of neutrality. If you may remember, China in the past has said that it's kind of neutral on the Ukraine war. Well, now it's no longer Ukraine. It's no longer neutral on the Ukraine war. It has taken a very clear stand and a very clear side in the Ukraine conflict. So why is this important? So this signal, it represents a very important shift, a critical shift in China's diplomatic posture. And now it's more explicit strategic alignment with Russia that is being signaled by China. And the timing of this new stance that China has publicly taken, which coincides with Russia's increasingly escalating military campaign, which we just discussed, this suggests that there is to some extent there is coordinated messaging with Russia, and this indicates that China is willing to risk further deterioration in its relations with the EU to prevent a Russian defeat. Well, it doesn't look like there's a Russian defeat that's imminent, but yeah. And China obviously views Russia not doing well in the Ukraine conflict as something that threatens its own strategic interests. So this could be an indicator, a harbinger of forthcoming, perhaps increased Chinese economic, technological, and potential covert military support for Russia. And this could transform the conflict into a two-sided proxy war. On the West, on the one hand, you have Ukraine, which is a proxy of the West, and on the other hand, China may seek to transform Russia into a proxy of China. And we have discussed this in the past, how China treats Russia like a junior partner, and so on. This could become a two-sided proxy war now. So Mr. Wang Yi, the foreign minister of China, he told the EU that China cannot accept Russia losing this war against Ukraine. And there are reports that Chinese components are increasingly found in Russian weapons, and that Russia is using Chinese technology for its drone warfare. And we obviously know that China-Russia economic cooperation has been deepening ever since the war began to counter American and Western sanctions. So the forecast is that EU-China relations will deteriorate further. The EU will accelerate efforts to reduce its economic dependencies on China, and the EU will accelerate its efforts to align more with American positions on technology and security. And this comes at a time when Germany last week accused a Chinese warship of a laser attack in the Red Sea. And European defense, as we know, is now its defense spending is increasing with a new focus on China, with a new focus on Russia as well. And this coincides with, like what we just discussed, the unprecedented Russian aerial assaults on Ukraine. So there's clearly some kind of coordination between Russia and China. And this deepens the geopolitical divide, the East-West divide. I'm not considering India as part of this, but it does deepen this divide. Now, next we have Europe, and something significant is happening in Europe. So the European security architecture has shifted. It's in the process of shifting because the UK and France have signed a historic nuclear pact. The UK and France have signed an unprecedented nuclear weapons cooperation agreement, and this move is explicitly framed as a response to what they call growing threats in Europe. So this deal aims to coordinate the UK and France's nuclear deterrence capabilities. So they'll coordinate this nuclear defense deterrence capabilities. And this is a major step clearly towards European strategic autonomy. And, Europe trying to have options beyond the United States. So why is it important? Why does this matter? Why is this a very important development? So this is an agreement that signals a profound shift, like I said, in in the European security architecture. Europe has two independent nuclear powers, which is the UK and France. Now, I'm not sure about the UK's nuclear deterrent. It's very possible, it's very likely, in my opinion, that the big red button actually it's situated in Washington DC, not London. But we still regard the UK as an independent nuclear power. So we have two independent nuclear powers in Western Europe, which is France and the UK, and obviously the Eastern nuclear power in the region is obviously Russia. So the UK and France are now going to coordinate their nuclear deterrence outside, and this is significant, outside of the traditional NATO framework. Historically, everything has happened within the framework of NATO. Now, this is an extra NATO agreement. This goes beyond NATO. It's outside the NATO framework. So this agreement, this pact, is a direct response to what they call heightened Russian aggression. And more importantly, this is a response to doubts about the long-term reliability of the US security guarantee, particularly under this Trump administration. So this development could accelerate wider European defense integration, and this clearly marks a momentous event, a pivotal event, a foundational event, a foundational moment in the development of an independent European security pillar. Monsieur Macron, the French President Macron, has called for UK-France cooperation to save Europe and to reduce Europe's dependency on the US and China. So my forecast is that this agreement is going to set off a chain reaction. It's going to accelerate wider, broader European defense integration. And I forecast that Germany and Poland will most likely announce increased defense cooperation with France and the UK within the next 90 days. So very, very momentous development has happened. Now let's see what is next. Next, we have what they call the Indo-Pacific region, Asia Pacific. The US is exploring using South Korean bases for a Taiwan contingency, for a possible future Taiwan contingency. What's Taiwan? Obviously, the possible future Chinese attempt to invade and capture Taiwan. So the US has this Indo-Pacific Command, and this Indo-Pacific Command is actively exploring the use of South Korean military bases to support operations in a potential future Taiwan conflict in which China potentially attempts an invasion of Taiwan. And this development comes at a time when there are other strains, other alliance strains. There's a US proposal to reduce troop numbers. There's South Korea's cancellation of a $3.5 billion Apache helicopter deal, Apache helicopter purchase. So it comes at a pretty tumultuous time. And why is this important? This potential shift, if it happens, in South Korea's strategic posture could fundamentally alter the security dynamics of the region, Northeast Asian security dynamics. South Korea has traditionally avoided direct involvement in the Taiwan security equation. Now, drawing South Korea into this would be a major strategic win for the US, but that will almost guaranteedly trigger a very harsh and severe reaction from China. So this move that the US is actively exploring this, it indicates that the US is actually actively preparing for military contingencies involving Taiwan, which is a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And the US is seeking to distribute operational risk beyond its bases in Japan and Guam. I mean, the US has a very large number of bases in South Korea as well. Why not operationalize those? Makes sense, right? So there you have it, right? So when this happens, it's gonna trigger diplomatic warnings from China. It will potentially the Chinese will potentially impose targeted economic measures against South Korea, which is sanctions essentially. And the core assumption is that the US is anticipating trouble over Taiwan. increasing tensions over Taiwan. And the US requires extended basing options beyond Japan and beyond Guam. And there are historical precedents to this. In the past, China, in 2017, after the South Koreans purchased the THAAD system from the US, the Chinese retaliated against South Korea economically. So uh, we have a historical precedent for this. And it's interesting that this comes at a time when the US has imposed 25% tariffs on South Korean imports. And an American think tank has proposed a dramatic reduction of US troops in the Korean peninsula. So you have a complex environment of pressure and strategic demands and tariffs and trade war and economic pressure and whatnot. And China is increasing its military pressure on Taiwan, as we know. The past, it's been an ever rising trend. There's recently been aircraft carrier deployments in the region. The Chinese have established new trade routes through the Taiwan Strait. So this all of these measures, these Chinese actions, they have raised the perceived likelihood of a contingency, a Taiwan contingency. And obviously, there's the North Korea factor. There have been renewed North Korean missile tests and what the West calls provocations, which further complicates the security calculations for South Korea and for this entire region. Now, let's talk about China and Chinese ICBMs. So China has made a rare disclosure on its DF-5B intercontinental ballistic missile capabilities. And this could signal a strategic shift in their nuclear doctrine, possibly. So the Chinese have publicly disclosed silo location details of its DF-5B ICBMs. And this is unusual transparency. China is renowned for being opaque, for being an opaque nation, opaqueness. But this is unusual transparency, right? Unusual transparency when it comes to its nuclear arsenal. And maybe this suggests that there could be an impending shift in China's strategic nuclear doctrine. So why does this matter? Why is it important? So this is a rare nuclear disclosure. It signals a departure from China's traditional opacity. And this may possibly be aimed at deterring US intervention in Taiwan scenarios, the South Korea thing which we just discussed, and so on. And the timing of this disclosure in the middle of the tensions in the Middle East region, the Russia-NATO tensions, the Ukraine war, all of this once again suggests that there is coordinated signaling between Russia and China. And this transparency shift, it possibly indicates that China is increasingly confident about its nuclear deterrence capabilities, and they are willing to use it diplomatically for a change. So yeah, that's an interesting development that's happened, very unusual. And then let's talk about India. Like I said, we're going to discuss India and the US trade deal, the Indo-US trade deal. So India has secured what they're calling an imminent trade deal with the US. And India seems to have dodged the global tariff onslaught that the Trump administration has launched, the trade war that they've launched on the entire world. India seems to have dodged this. And India seems to have secured an imminent trade deal. So the trade deal hasn't happened yet. It hasn't happened, but India seems to be on the verge of securing or finalizing a mini trade deal with the Trump administration. So India has been able to successfully navigate Trump's aggressive global tariff strategy, and India will most likely secure an exemption. So this diplomatic success, it comes at a time when the US is threatening punitive tariffs against at least 14 other nations. It's just begun. You're going to have more. And this includes India's BRICS partners and key allies, you could say, or key partners, Asian partners of India, as well as Asian partners of the US allies in Asia, like South Korea, like Japan, right? So why is this important? This is very important. So India's ability to secure this deal while other major American allies are facing tariffs, this is very important. What does it indicate? What does it mark? It marks a significant diplomatic victory for Prime Minister Modi and for India. And this shows that India is increasingly more important strategically to the US as a key counterbalance to China in what the Americans call the Indo-Pacific region. So this outcome, this being on the verge of finalizing a mini trade deal, it validates India's delicate multi-alignment foreign policy, not non-alignment, but multi-alignment foreign policy. And India has been able to successfully balance its membership in the BRICS bloc with its what looks like India's deepening partnership with the United States. So India is being given preferential treatment by the Trump administration. This is in stark contrast to how the Trump administration is handling its key Asian allies, Japan and South Korea. So there's a clear message or indication that the Trump administration is prioritizing India in its foreign and economic policy, not because they love India or because they're great friends with India, but because India matters strategically. India is very important strategically, and they can't do without India's cooperation. So this mini trade deal has been described as being imminent, very close. Maybe a finalized agreement will happen within the next 48 hours, a mini trade deal. And the background to all of this is that India refused to lower tariffs on small cars, and India did not capitulate to US pressure on agricultural products. And India reserved its right to impose retaliatory auto tariffs. So India took a very hard stance against the US, a very hard negotiating position, a very aggressive negotiating position. That tells you that India did its homework. And India calculated perfectly how important it is strategically to the US, and to what extent the US is willing to go and what the US is not willing to do. So India has secured an 18-month tariff adjustment period for pharmaceuticals, and India has said that it will not, capitulate to US demands and agree to some kind of a trade deal by the July 9 deadline. So the deadline has come and gone, but the US has not imposed all these sanctions, all these tariffs on India, and we are on the verge of a trade deal, maybe in the next 48 hours. This is a significant victory for India if this trade deal happens. This mini trade deal happens, and then the tango continues, the dance continues over the next few months until we finalize the overall trade deal with the US, the bigger trade deal. Okay, now let's take a look at some soft signals. Soft signals are emerging developments that are not dominating headlines right now, but these are like the seeds of future big events. So these could significantly shape future geopolitical trajectories down the road. What's the first notable soft signal that we have? So China has discovered a massive lithium deposit, which will obviously strengthen its position in critical minerals. And this lithium reserve has been discovered in the Xinjiang province. It's a 2.8 million ton lithium reserve. This will amplify China's leverage in the ongoing technology disputes with the West. This could potentially shift the global lithium market dynamics. It could reduce China's import dependence from 70% to 40% perhaps by 2027. This will definitely give China way more leverage than it has right now. China already has a significant amount of leverage in the ongoing technological disputes with the West because of its dominance in the rare earth minerals. And now it's going to amplify China's leverage. So what could most likely happen is that the Chinese government state-directed development will most likely bypass any environmental reviews, which will enable very rapid production scaling of this lithium deposit. And China already has significant processing capabilities. So in a short while, China could control 85% of refined lithium supply chains. which could create an unprecedented choke point power over global electric vehicle transitions. And there are historical precedents of this sort of thing. In 2010, Chinese rare earth export restrictions sparked global supply chain diversification. So there's a precedent for this, historical precedent. Now, here's an interesting development. This is something that people aren't really paying attention to. Russia, I mean, we have discussed this on this show the past few weeks. We have been discussing the strained Russia-China relationship and the fact that Russia regards China as an actual enemy, despite whatever modus vivendi the two nations have currently. So Russia has established a counter-intelligence program to curb Chinese espionage. Okay, this new counterintelligence program that Russia has established, it's called Entente 4, and its objective is to specifically curb Chinese espionage operations, spying operations. So this indicates that there are growing tensions within the Russia-China relationship despite their public alignment against the West. Why is this important? This development reveals that there is significant friction and mistrust beneath the surface of their so-called no limits partnership. This indicates that as Russia becomes more economically dependent on China, more technologically dependent on China because of Western sanctions, because as this is happening, Russia is increasingly concerned about Chinese intelligence penetrating its military and defense industrial base during a time when Russia is especially vulnerable because of the Western sanctions. And this tells us that this Russia-China alignment is more a temporary marriage of convenience against a common adversary. It's not a durable, trust-based alliance. And this shows there are fissures and fractures in the relationship that their adversaries could exploit, that the US could exploit. So this signal provides a crucial counterpoint to the numerous reports of deepening Russia-China cooperation, such as China's statement that it cannot accept, like we discussed, a Russian defeat in Ukraine. And there are historical precedents to this sort of thing. Russia has historically maintained counterintelligence operations against all major powers, including nominal allies of Russia. But the creation of a specific program that targets only one nation, China, it represents an unusual escalation. So things are not well in the Russia-China relationship. Now let's discuss our friend Elon Musk. Elon Musk has formed the America Party after criticizing Donald Trump's tax bill as creating debt slavery. So the American tech oligarch Elon Musk has announced the third party formation of this party, America Party, right? It's a third party. I mean, any party beyond the Republicans and Democrats is called a third party, typically in the US. So he has created this new party, and he's opposing the Trump administration's fiscal policies. And there could be, a new interesting activity in Silicon Valley, maybe donations to the party, and maybe there could be a potential 2028 disruption as there's this emerging what you call billionaire populism in the US. So is this important? I think it's important. So Elon Musk's formation of this new party, the America Party, it fragments the administration's tech oligarch coalition just 6 months into Donald Trump's second term. And Elon Musk has 420 million followers on social media that provides him an unprecedented amount of third-party reach. And that could potentially, if he starts building on that right now, from right now onwards, this could potentially be very important by 2028, right? And this framing, the debt slavery framing, it resonates with younger people, younger demographic in the US who are facing inflation and the housing crisis and all kinds of other crises. And Silicon Valley, if it realigns politically with Elon Musk, it could shift the campaign finance dynamics in future US elections, especially if other tech leaders follow and get on board with this new party. So this marks the first billionaire led party in the US with actual grassroots digital infrastructure. So in the past, you had such things. Historical precedent in 1992, Ross Perot, he had this Reform Party, and it peaked at 19%. It was pretty popular. 19% is not bad, but this party lacked any digital organizing tools because you had no social media back in the day, and that's why it was not really did not end up being viable. But now this could be a game changer. Let's see how it goes. If Elon Musk plays the game right, it could become really important in the next 2-3 years. Obviously, Elon Musk was born outside of the US. Um, yeah, so you can't become president of the US if you are born outside the US. Um, Most likely. I mean, there have been questions about Barack Obama, but let's not go there for 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 the purpose of this show. Now let's discuss Pakistan. So Pakistan's military establishment, the Pakistani military dictatorship, has established direct control over the Gwadar port. It has sidelined the civilian government of Pakistan, which is, well, par for the course, I suppose, for Pakistan. So the Pakistani army has created a special economic authority for China's Belt and Road project, the crown jewel of the China-Pakistan economic cooperation, right? Um, so that's the deal. So now, why is it important? Is this important? Yes, it is important. So this move crystallizes the Pakistani army, the military's economic empire expansion beyond the traditional defense industries. And they're now controlling Pakistan's most strategic infrastructure directly. So China faces a dilemma. Military control ensures security. Direct military control of Gwadar ensures that there'll be security in Gwadar, which China needs, but it undermines governance stability, which China claims to support. So China claims to support governance stability in Pakistan, but now you have a direct army takeover of the port, which kind of undermines China's public stance. And this development could trigger a political crisis potentially, which could, if that happens, it could threaten Chinese investments. And this precedent enables the military to, in the future, capture other economic zones of Pakistan directly. And Balochistan freedom fighter groups will most likely intensify attacks on military controlled assets. Uh, and you've had a historical precedent of this. The 1999, there was a military coup in Pakistan. What's that guy's name? Musharraf took over. He ousted Nawaz Sharif, right? So this was the 1999 Pakistan military coup, and this followed economic intervention expansion. So this move could entrench military power in civilian infrastructure now going forward. Um, and this tests China's non-interference principle versus investment protection, China's imperatives of investment protection, right, in Pakistan. And obviously should be this opportunity. This gives an opportunity to India to highlight Pakistan's democratic deficits, and this is an opportunity that India should not miss. Now let's talk about the US and the UN, the United Nations. The US has sanctioned a UN human rights investigator over her investigation into Israel's alleged human rights abuses in Gaza. So the US has imposed sanctions on this person, Francesca Albanese, and she has been investigating these alleged human rights abuses in Gaza. She is very pro-Palestine, first of all. So this is an unprecedented move by the US against a UN human rights official. Why is this important? Is this important? It is. This action that the US has taken, it represents a significant break from diplomatic norms. It's a direct challenge by the US to the authority and independence of UN human rights mechanisms. In the past, the US has supported UN human rights mechanisms when they are used against India. But when it comes to these things being used against the prime US ally Israel, the US has flip flopped and they have sanctioned this investigator. So, by sanctioning a UN appointed investigator, the US is signaling its willingness to use powerful economic tools to shield Israel from international scrutiny. And this could undermine America's own credibility on the issue of human rights, which it champions all the time. So this could undermine the US's credibility on human rights. It could expose the US as being hypocritical, and this could potentially isolate the US potentially in international forums. And this move is a dangerous precedent. This could potentially embolden other nations in the future to disregard or attack UN investigators. And this further politicizes the international human rights system. So there are no historical precedents of this. There is no direct precedent of any nation sanctioning a UN special reporter, which makes this a potentially watershed moment in the history of the UN and in the history of US UN relations. So this action that the US has taken, it aligns with the Trump administration's broader pushback against various international institutions. They are threatening tariffs against the entire BRICS bloc, and they are taking a more transactional approach to alliances and disregarding alliances and dealing one to one with nations on occasion and so on. And this action also coincides with the EU considering sanctions on Israeli settlement products, which shows that there is a growing transatlantic divide on how to address the Israel Gaza conflict. So these are the soft signals that we need to keep in mind going forward. Now, what are the top storylines to track in the coming days, coming weeks, and months? There's a lot, but there's a lot of things that's happening. But I have chosen a few that are particularly important. I can't obviously highlight all the storylines that are happening. Many of these are important, but I have chosen a few. And these are major geopolitical developments that are likely to dominate the international landscape in the coming months. So, what is number one? Number one, obviously, is the US trade war against the world. Trump's trade policy has ignited a global economic conflict. The Trump administration has dramatically escalated global trade tensions by implementing and threatening sweeping new tariffs against American allies and American adversaries. They're treating everybody the same. Very nice. And this is triggering a new era of protectionism. It's accelerating the fragmentation of the global economy. And like we discussed, Trump has announced 25% tariffs on Japan, South Korea, 50% tariffs on all Brazilian imports, threats of 10 to 70% reciprocal tariffs on at least 14 other nations. And there's an August 1 implementation deadline. And this is a very aggressive, broad-based tariff strategy. It moves beyond the initial China-centric trade war that the Trump administration had launched, and it's now a systemic challenge of the global trade order. So they are trying to dismantle the entire global trade order, the global economic order. The US is forcing a rapid realignment of the major economic blocks of the world. For example, BRICS, and there's an ongoing realignment because of this pressure of global supply chains, of global diplomatic relationships. And nations are now scrambling to form countermeasures against the US actions, and nations are scrambling to form alternative economic partnerships. So my forecast is that and this is something I said in the beginning of the show, multiple nations will announce retaliatory tariffs against the US within the next 14 to 30 days. And at the same time, they will seek exemptions through accelerated bilateral negotiations with the United States. This is a probability of 90% of happening in the next 14 to 30 days. Next, what do we have? So the BRICS plus bloc has now emerged as a solid anti-tariff de-dollarization coalition. They're moving beyond the dollar to some extent, and we'll see how it goes. So the BRICS group has formally expanded. It's rapidly consolidating into a coherent economic bloc. It's issuing unified condemnation of US tariffs and the US trade war against the world. And BRICS is now accelerating plans to reduce dependence on the US dollar. And so BRICS has expanded to include Egypt, Ethiopia, and other nations. It has issued a joint. There was this summit just recently in Brazil. They have issued a joint Rio de Janeiro declaration. They have expressed serious concerns in this declaration over U.S. tariff policies. And the U.S. President, Mr. Trump, has responded by threatening an additional 10% tariff on the entire bloc. So the BRICS expansion and its coordinated response to the US economic pressure, this marks a significant geopolitical shift, you could say, towards a more multipolar world. BRICS now represents a substantial portion of global GDP and the global population, and it's actively building parallel financial and trade institutions to challenge Western-dominated systems. And it's interesting. So I have not focused on BRICS in this episode, but it's interesting that Xi Jinping did not attend the Rio summit. Mr. Putin did attend it virtually. Mr. Xi Jinping chose to not attend at all. So China was kind of missing from the summit. And India seems to have dominated the summit to a certain extent, at least. So the BRICS expansion and its coordinated response to US economic pressure, this marks a significant geopolitical shift towards a more multipolar world. And India is obviously, like we discussed, it's navigating a complex balancing act. It's warning against the weaponization of critical minerals. Prime Minister Modi issued this statement in Rio de Janeiro. He warned against the weaponization of critical minerals, which is within BRICS itself, which implicitly targets China. And India is also facing US tariff threats as a member of the BRICS bloc. So that's one of the ongoing storylines that we need to track. BRICS Plus and its evolution as an economic coalition. Next, we discuss the Indo-Pacific. And strategic alliances are hardening in the Indo-Pacific region. There's a network of interlocking security alliances that is rapidly solidifying in the Indo-Pacific region. The objective is obviously to counter China's assertiveness, let's call it, right? And what we are seeing is that there is unprecedented military cooperation. There are asset transfers. There are joint exercises among US allies, which is obviously the Indo-Pacific nations. It's the Quad nations, the US, Australia, Japan, India, there's the Philippines, the South Korea, there's Taiwan also in the mix, and so on. So what's the latest development been? And the UK is involved in this, right? So the latest development is that a British-led naval task group formed with the US, Australia, Japan, and other regional states. So that's been formed. Japan is transferring 6 destroyers to the Philippines. The US, like we discussed, is exploring the use of South Korean bases for potential future Taiwan contingencies. So we are witnessing what you could call a historic military realignment in the region, the Indo-Pacific region. Japan has decided to arm the Philippines, right? It's the first time this sort of thing has happened since the Second World War. It's a direct challenge, you could say, to China's maritime expansion. In the formation of a multinational naval task force and the potential expansion of US basing options in South Korea, this indicates a more integrated, a more multilateral deterrence posture is emerging to complement the Quad framework and the AUKUS framework. So my forecast is that this naval coalition will conduct increasingly assertive freedom of navigation operations, FONOPs, in what you could call contested waters, which is particularly the South China Sea, within the next 90 days. And the probability of this happening in my assessment, is 80%. So we are witnessing the hardening of strategic alliances in the Indo-Pacific region. And another thing we need to keep discussing is the European security architecture, which is undergoing historic realignment. There are doubts about US reliability. There are persistent threats, this persistent threat perception about Russia. Uh, so in in this, in the middle of all of this, uh, and because of these assessments, key European powers like the UK and France are taking unprecedented steps, like we discussed, towards strategic autonomy. And the highlight of this thus far has been this landmark UK France nuclear pact. And Germany is planning a massive rearmament. So all of this indicates that the European security architecture is undergoing a historic realignment. The latest development, obviously, is the UK and France, the UK France nuclear weapons cooperation agreement, historic deal. Um, and the EU presidency has been warning of a significant Russian threat by 2030, and they're calling for rapid rearmament. And the EU and the NATO nations have decided, they've agreed to increase their military budgets to 5% of GDP in the next 10 years. So this is a significant shift, a significant realignment, right? Germany is potentially going to procure 1,000 tanks. EU is going to allow deficit spending for defense. So all of this points towards the emergence of a more independent European defense pillar. But this push is complicated. It's complicated by internal divisions within the EU, which is bound to happen. Slovakia has vetoed new Russia sanctions. That's an example, right? But overall, this agreement, my forecast is that this agreement will accelerate broader European defense defense integration efforts. Germany and Poland will announce increased defense cooperation with France and the UK in the next 90 days. And the prediction probability of this is 75%. Now, let's discuss India. India is navigating a high stakes geopolitical balancing act skillfully. India is skillfully navigating the intensifying great power competition. So, what is India doing? India is simultaneously finalizing a trade deal with the US to avoid American tariffs. India is at the same time asserting its leadership of the global south within the BRICS framework. India is countering a coordinated China-Pakistan threat, and India is actively considering Russian offers of weapons and technology transfers. So that's a pretty skillful balancing act that India is doing. And the latest development is this: India is on the verge, possibly, of a mini trade deal with the US. India will most likely secure an exemption from the US from Trump's tariff threats. At the BRICS summit, Prime Minister Modi warned against the weaponization of critical minerals, which was an implicit challenge to China within the BRICS framework itself. So India is leveraging its strategic importance to the US as a critical Indo-Pacific counterbalance to China to secure favorable economic terms. At the same time, it's using the BRICS platform to dominate, to champion global South interests and to prevent Chinese domination, right? And this is a very delicate balancing act. It's being tested by direct threats. There are revelations of a three adversary axis, which is Pakistan, China, and Turkey at the same time. India is facing sanctions from the Chinese, China's rare earth export bans, China's restrictions on specialized fertilizers, etc. Right? So all of this is happening at the same time. It's a pretty delicate balancing act that India is doing, and the China-Pakistan intelligence sharing during the recent Operation Sindoor 3-day war, it reveals that there is a deepening strategic alliance between China and Pakistan, which will cause India to accelerate its defense partnerships with the Quad nations, with European powers, with Russia, etc. Uh, yeah, so India faces all these security challenges, and India is doing its best to navigate this particular period of time. And then let's discuss India and China. There is now a buildup of Chinese troops on the line of actual control between India and Chinese occupied Tibet. So there's a strategic realignment, as we know. China-Pakistan axis has emerged very pretty openly against India, and at the same time, China has massed 50,000 troops near the line of actual control. Uh, and India is simultaneously strengthening its ties with the US through defense agreements. India is maintaining BRICS partnerships, right? India is accelerating its military modernization with US equipment. It has Russian offers on the table of very, very sophisticated weapons like the Sukhoi 57 and other things. India is participating in BRICS initiatives. And all of this is testing India's multi alignment strategy. So India's multi-alignment strategy is now facing a critical test because China is trying to force India to choose between territorial security and economic partnerships. And this military buildup, this Chinese military buildup on the LAC, it suggests that China is testing India's resolve at a time when there is this wider US-China competition. So my forecast is that there is a likelihood, 60% likelihood of limited border skirmishes between Indian and Chinese troops in the next 45 days. And this could push India towards deeper cooperation, defense cooperation with the US, and maintaining, at the same time, maintaining economic hedging through BRICS. So in my assessment, there's a 60% likelihood of this sort of thing happening in the next month and a half. With that said, let's do some forecasting. We'll not do 5 different forecasts this time. In this episode, we'll do 2 forecasts with multiple scenarios. So forecast for the next 7 to 180 days. These are strategic projections of how key geopolitical dynamics are likely to evolve in the short to medium term. Medium term is 6 months, 180 days. So first of all, European strategic realignment is likely to accelerate. It's going to be driven by US unpredictability. It's going to be driven by by EU perceptions of Russian aggression, and driven by these perceptions and by the unpredictability of the Trump administration. Europe is rapidly reassessing its security architecture, as we have seen, and its strategic autonomy. So what are the scenarios that we can think of? What's the most likely scenario? The most likely scenario is scenario A, pragmatic autonomy. The EU becomes pragmatically autonomous. And in my assessment, there is a 75% chance of seeing moves towards this direction in the next 90 to 180 days. So in this scenario, the EU will be led by France and Germany. Remember, the UK is no longer part of the EU. So the EU will be led by France and Germany. And led by France and Germany, the EU will deepen its strategic autonomy incentives. This includes a new French-UK nuclear cooperation agreement. This includes Germany's massive military rearmament program. And there's going to be a EU-wide defense industrial strategy. So the EU most of the EU nations, many of them are members of NATO. So they will remain within NATO. But while remaining within NATO, these nations will increasingly act as a distinct geopolitical pole. They will engage China in a limited manner on trade. They will engage Russia through their own sanctions or diplomacy, whatever they feel is best. And they may at times be at odds with US policy. For example, on issues of tariffs, on matters related to Iran, possibly, and so on. And what's the potential geopolitical impact of this? So this emergence of a more capable and a more independent European pillar within NATO, this could emerge, and this could potentially lead to a more balanced transatlantic relationship between the European nations and the US, and the relationship will also become more complex as a consequence. Now, what are the key assumptions behind scenario A, pragmatic autonomy? So first of all, the EU has concerns about US unpredictability. Trump's tariffs, Trump's trade war against the world. And the EU has concerns about potential Russian aggression, massive assaults on Ukraine, which we are seeing, and they're worried that this will eventually spill over into Western Europe. And so these concerns that the EU has are powerful enough to overcome whatever internal divisions may exist within the EU. The other assumption is that France and Germany, they have some differences. They have had some differences historically, right? But despite whatever differences they have, they remain committed to leading this push for European autonomy. They are the most powerful, they're the most prominent nations in the EU, so they have got to lead. And the assumption is that this historic UK-France nuclear agreement, it signals a new willingness for pragmatic cooperation between the EU and the UK post-Brexit. And there's a historical precedent, the launch of PESCO, Permanent Structured Cooperation, and the European Defence Fund in 2017, which were the initial steps towards this greater autonomy following the first Trump administration and Brexit. So that's the historical precedent, and now that has led us to where we are today. And obviously, there are potential counterpoints to this, or there are divisions within the EU, which are exemplified by Hungary's veto against sanctions on Russia, Slovakia's vetoes against sanctions on Russia. And if this continues, that could paralyze any truly unified foreign policy action. So that could happen. And obviously, we know that the US military power, the scale of US military power means that European autonomy will remain a long-term aspiration rather than a short-term reality. Because European military power, even if it is magnified fivefold, will still be a fraction of what the US military power is and US military capabilities are. So these are potential counterpoints to scenario A. What is scenario B? Scenario B is a transatlantic fracture. This has, in my assessment, a probability of 15%. It's a low probability scenario, and the time frame is 120 to 180 days. So in this scenario, US tariffs on European goods are implemented harshly. This leads to a full-blown US-EU trade war. And in response to this, the EU accelerates its military and economic pivot away from the US. The EU possibly signs a major trade and investment agreement with China, and the EU significantly reduces its reliance on US military hardware and leadership. This could lead to a functional breakdown of NATO's political cohesion, and this would be a fundamental split in the Western alliance. This could create a major power vacuum, and this would present significant opportunities for Russia as well as China. This is scenario B. What are the key assumptions behind this? First key assumption is that the Trump administration prioritizes its America First policy, its America First trade agenda, over maintaining the transatlantic alliance. Short-termism, my agenda first, that sort of thing. The second assumption is that the EU is willing to take and able to take the massive economic and the security risks that are associated with a definitive break from the US. Another assumption is that the Chinese offer the EU a significantly attractive alternative partnership to make this pivot viable for the EU, and so on. So there's been historical precedents of this. You may remember the 2003 Iraq war. There was a significant split between the US and the EU, especially the US and France, right? The Americans went to the extent of renaming French fries to freedom fries and French toast to freedom toast, that sort of thing. So this split created a severe transatlantic crisis, which ultimately turned out to be temporary. But this scenario B that we are talking about, it envisions a more permanent fracture between the two sides of the Atlantic, the US and the EU. Now, there obviously are potential counterpoints to this scenario, and that's why it has a probability of only 15%. First of all, there is a severe security threat perception that the EU has vis-a-vis Russia. They are worried about a Russian invasion in the future of Western Europe, and this obviously is most likely too acute. This threat perception is most likely too acute for the EU to risk a break from their primary security guarantor. Secondly, economic interdependencies with the US are way deeper than any economic relations the EU has with China, which makes a full pivot away from the US economically unfeasible. And there are pro transatlantic states within the EU, Poland, the Baltic nations, and so on. And these nations would veto, they would block any move that jeopardizes the US security umbrella. So that is scenario B, 15% probability. What is scenario C? Scenario C is European subordination, 10%. I mean, the EU is already subordinate to the US, but way more, way more. That's what we're talking about. So this has a probability of 10% over the next 60 to 120 days. In this scenario, the EU is faced with overwhelming American economic pressure. They are faced at the same time with a severe Russian threat perception, military threat perception. And because of these two factors, the EU's push for strategic autonomy falters. EU member states decide to prioritize bilateral deals with the US to avoid tariffs, and this fractures the unity within the European Union. And then the EU falls back into its traditional subordinate role to the US. It largely follows America's lead on foreign policy towards Russia and China, which has been the traditional role of the EU, despite whatever you may believe. Right? And the geopolitical impact, the consequences of this is that there's going to be a reassertion of American primacy over a weakened and divided Europe, but this will come at the cost of long-term European capability and partnership with the US. What are the key assumptions behind scenario C? Firstly, the first key assumption is that US economic leverage is powerful enough to break EU unity. And that's a pretty good assumption, in my opinion. Right? Secondly, second assumption is that the Russian threat is perceived to be so severe that European Union states feel that they have no alternative but to give in, to acquiesce to American demands to ensure security guarantees. And once again, there are lots of EU nations that have this threat perception that Russia could end up, in a few years, walking up to their doorstep. The third assumption is that the Franco-German engine that drives that is the primary driver of EU autonomy, potential EU autonomy. It stalls because of internal political disagreements, which also could happen, right? And obviously there are counterpoints. There's a strong trend of European pushback against the US. For example, Macron's statements, threats of retaliation to US tariffs and so on, which suggests that a return to complete subordination is kind of unlikely. Then obviously there are the dual threats from the US, economic threats from the US, military threats from Russia, and these are more likely to galvanize a unified European response than to fracture it. And obviously years of investment in EU institutions have created a path dependency that is difficult to reverse. So that's why this scenario C, has a 10% probability of happening. The most likely scenario is scenario A, which we just discussed. Scenario A is pragmatic autonomy. And when it comes to scenario C, there is a historical precedent. During the Cold War, there were periods when European nations had private misgivings with US policies, etc., but they ultimately aligned with US policy because of the overwhelming Soviet threat perception that they faced. So that is about the EU. Now, what is the second forecast that we're going to make in the show, in this episode? That is India. India is most likely going to successfully execute a multi-alignment strategy. It will most likely, in my assessment, gain concessions from the US and BRICS blocks simultaneously. It will gain concessions from the US, also from the BRICS bloc. So what is scenario A? Scenario A is that India will become the pivotal state, and it will succeed at becoming the pivotal state. This scenario, in my assessment, has a 70% probability of happening over the next 30 to 90 days. In this scenario, first of all, India will finalize a mini trade deal with the US. which could happen in the next 48 hours possibly. So India will secure an exemption from the harshest tariffs, uh, which could target BRICS nations. At the same time, at the BRICS summit, Prime Minister Modi has successfully positioned India as probably the leader of the global South, and he has warned against the weaponization of critical minerals, which is a veiled critique of China. And Prime Minister Modi has secured Russian oil and is exploring multiple new partnerships. So India is in the process of leveraging its dual position in the Quad and BRICS to extract maximum benefit from both blocks, and this will end up enhancing India's strategic autonomy. So the potential geopolitical impact of this is that this will solidify India's role as a major independent global power, a power that is capable of shaping agendas in competing blocks, and it's capable of and a power that's capable of acting as a key swing state in the new world order, multi-aligned state, and genuinely sovereign, genuinely independent nation. 70% chance, a 70% probability of this happening over the next 30 to 90 days. What are the key assumptions behind this? First of all, the first assumption is that the US views India as a sufficiently critical strategic partner against China to warrant offering trade concessions, significant trade concessions, which the Americans are not willing to offer other nations. Secondly, the second key assumption is that China and Russia need India's participation to lend legitimacy to BRICS. And that's why China especially is willing to some extent to tolerate India's independence stance. Otherwise, there will be a fracture in BRICS, and BRICS will no longer be viable. If India pulls out of BRICS, BRICS is finished, it's done, right? So they need India's participation in BRICS to lend legitimacy to BRICS, especially China. Thirdly, the third assumption is that India's diplomatic core is skilled enough to navigate these contradictory relationships without a major misstep that would force India to choose sides definitively. Take it or leave it, take one side or the other, that sort of thing. And there have been historical precedents of this. India in the past successfully navigated the Cold War. At that time, India was the leader of the non-aligned movement. India was able to maintain relations with the US and the USSR simultaneously while preserving much of its independence. That was the non-aligned movement days. Today, we are multi-aligned. It's a whole different story, right? Obviously, there are counterpoints to this. There is obviously increasing US-China polarization right now, and that could make this balancing act difficult to sustain. And both sides would eventually demand a more definitive alignment that could happen. But right now, it looks like the most likely scenario is scenario A, the pivotal state scenario, independent, and a pivotal state, 70% probability of happening over the next 30 to 90 days. What is scenario B? Scenario B is that India gets caught in the crossfire. That's a 25% chance of this happening, not a small probability, 25% probability of this happening over the next 60 to 120 days. In the past, we have discussed this scenario. We have discussed various variations of the scenario. The last week, I had done a forecast in which there were 4 scenarios. Those are scenario D. This time I've just kept 3 scenarios because things are changing. Every week things change and more information becomes available, which allows us to refine our forecasts and scenarios. So scenario B is that India gets caught in the crossfire. 25% of probability of this happening over the next 60 to 120 days. In this scenario, the US refuses to grant India a full tariff exemption. The US views India's BRICS membership and Russia's oil purchases as unacceptable. And simultaneously, China and Russia, mainly China, angered by India's critiques on critical minerals and angered by India's deepening ties with the Quad, they marginalize India within BRICS, which fragments BRICS and makes BRICS unviable without India, whatever. And India then finds that its policy of multi-alignment has left it isolated, and India then faces pressure from all sides without the full benefits of any single alliance. And this, if this happens, it would be a significant setback for India's rise as a global power, and it would be a demonstration of the limits of strategic autonomy in an increasingly bipolar, bifurcating world. So, what are the key assumptions behind scenario A? 25%. The key assumption, first of all, the first one is that the US administration will adopt a "you are either with us or against us" approach to its strategic partners, a binary approach. And then China will decide that the costs of India's independent stance outweigh the benefits of India being a member of BRICS. Right? These are the two main key assumptions. And the third assumption is that India may end up overplaying its hand, and India may fail to correctly gauge the red lines of its various partners, which I think is unlikely to happen, which is why this scenario has a 25% probability of happening. What are the potential counterpoints to this? Well, India's market size, huge market size, and India's incredible God-gifted strategic location make India too important for either either of the blocks to alienate completely. And secondly, the shared security concerns regarding China are a powerful glue that bind India to the Quad and to the US, even with trade frictions and whatnot. And thirdly, Russia's dependence on Indian markets, especially for oils and also for arms sales, give India significant leverage in that relationship. And Russia doesn't want to become completely dependent on China. And Russia does want India to keep rising as a counterbalance to China itself. Russia doesn't see China as an ally. Russia sees China as a threat, as we know very well. So all of these are counterpoints to scenario B, which is why it has a 25% likelihood of happening instead of a much larger likelihood. Do we have historical precedents of this? Yes, we do. So in the 1950s and 60s, Egypt experienced something like scenario B during the Nasser years. So Egypt had attempted at the time to play the US and the USSR off each other, and this led to periods of extreme pressure from both sides, and it did not work out well for Egypt. So that's a historical precedent that is a cautionary tale for us to keep in mind. Okay, what is scenario C? Scenario C is something we have discussed in the past. It is vassalage, definitive Western alignment. And in my assessment, this has only a 5% probability of happening, maybe in the next 90 to 180 days. Anything between that time period. So essentially, by the end of the year, we'll know where we stand. So in this scenario, there could be a potential future major external shock, maybe a large-scale Chinese military provocation along the India-Tibet undemarcated border, or maybe there could be the revelation of a direct Chinese intelligence support to Pakistan in a hypothetical future terror attack. So if something like this happens, which is a major external shock, this could force India to abandon its multi-alignment strategy. And then India will have to formally, officially, publicly pivot to the West, to the US. India will have to significantly, in that scenario, scale back its ties with Russia, its participation in BRICS. And India may have to sign a comprehensive strategic and economic and military alliance with the US. Sign officially, right? So if this happens, it would be a fundamental shift in global balance of power. And with the Western bloc, the US-dominated bloc significantly strengthened and the BRICS alliance critically weakened. So this can only happen if the Chinese provoke India with a major external shock. And this would be a fundamental miscalculation by India. So this, in my opinion, in my assessment, there's a 5% likelihood of happening over the next 90 to 180 days. Let's take a look at the key assumptions behind this. So the first key assumption is that China makes a major strategic blunder, miscalculation, that makes its threat perception in India override all other considerations. Secondly, the assumption is that India's long-standing tradition and policy of strategic autonomy can be jettisoned quickly in the face of an existential threat, and that is true. We can do that if there's an existential threat. And thirdly, the assumption is that the US will offer India a significantly robust security guarantee and economic package to make a full alignment attractive. What are the potential counterpoints to this? Well, India's India's institutional and political commitment has always been to strategic autonomy, and this is deeply entrenched in India's um, framework, and it would be incredibly difficult to reverse. That's number one, a very strong counterpoint to this scenario. Secondly, there is the desire in India to maintain at any cost a good relationship, a working relationship with Russia, which has been a long term partner of India, a reliable partner of India, a long term defense supplier. And this desire to maintain this partnership would temper any full pivot to the US. And thirdly, and most importantly, there will be tremendous domestic political costs for any Indian government that will be seen as subordinating itself to the United States. Such a government that takes that step, is essentially guaranteed to lose the next election. So that's why, because of these reasons, this scenario has a 5% likelihood of happening in my assessment. Do we have any historical precedents for this? So in 1962, in the face of Chinese aggression, India requested the US for military assistance. So this was a temporary break from its non-aligned policy, but a significant break for some time from India's non-aligned policy. So that these are the forecasts for this episode. Now let's take a look at some cross-regional patterns and systemic trends. This is like more involved stuff, but let's do it this week. We're gonna try and identify the interconnected dynamics that go beyond regional boundaries. And these dynamics, these hidden dynamics, they actually shape the global system. What's number one? Number one, we have technology driven strategic competition that we're witnessing in the world right now. This is all below the surface, but these are the forces that are driving the geopolitical realignment of the world. So first of all, we have semiconductor security. US led export controls on advanced chips and equipment. This has rippled across East Asia, Japan, Taiwan. It's rippled across Europe and the US, and also the US. This is driving accelerated alliance building in the Chip 4 framework and parallel efforts by China and the EU to develop indigenous supply chains, right? There is a push for digital sovereignty, Europe's Digital Markets and Services Acts, and parallel data localization laws in India. These are signaling that there's a global shift happening towards regulatory decoupling in digital infrastructure. Nobody wants to remain subordinate to the US. Everybody is trying to, localize data and be sovereign when it comes to the digital domain. So there's a regulatory decoupling that we are seeing in digital infrastructure, and this is affecting everything from 5G rollout in the Middle East to cloud services in Africa. And the takeaway from this is that these technological competition patterns are creating new geopolitical fault lines that transcend traditional regional boundaries. That's A. What's B? We have intensifying proxy and hybrid conflict. There is the situation in the Middle East, which is spilling over into Africa, right? Iran has expelled IAEA inspectors. Iran has stepped up its drone exports to the Houthis in Yemen. They're still called rebels for whatever reason, but yeah. And this is fueling instability in the Arabian Peninsula. And Russia, its private military support operations in sub-Saharan Africa through the Wagner Group and other militias, it's demonstrating that there's a growing security nexus in North Africa and the Sahel, which connects North Africa and the Sahel region. And there's diversification of energy suppliers. Europe is speeding up its LNG import project from the US and Qatar, and China is giving more oil for yuan initiatives in Africa and the Middle East. So we are seeing a bifurcation of energy trade corridors. So the takeaway from this is that these cross-regional patterns, okay, cross-regional patterns, they reveal how these conflicts and resource competitions, which happen in one regional, are increasingly affecting stability and strategic calculations in other regions. Then you have technology, security, economic interconnections. Let's examine how technological decouplements, security concerns, and economic interests are creating complex feedback loops in the international system. So you have dual use tech controls. It starts there. It leads to supply chain fragmentation, and that leads to inflationary pressures. So US chip controls and curbs, they undercut China's AI ambitions. Okay, that's a security objective, but they are also driving up costs for consumer electronics globally. Then you have uh, then you have additional security, technology, security, economic interconnections. For example, 5G infrastructure choices. Then that leads to surveillance capabilities, and that is impacting foreign FDIs, foreign direct investment. So countries are adopting Huawei. Companies that are adopting Huawei gear, they are facing increased scrutiny in Western capitals. This in turn influences FDI approvals and sovereign wealth allocations, which is creating economic consequences for security choices. Right? Then you have green tech subsidies, which have an effect on sovereign debt dynamics, which have an effect on geopolitical leverage. For example, Europe's 500 billion Green Deal package has empowered Brussels, the capital of the EU, to make funding on political reforms in recipient states like Ukraine and Macedonia conditional. So essentially it's linking economic support to political alignment. And the takeaway from all of this is that these interconnections, they show us how technology choices, security concerns, and economic relationships are increasingly inseparable in the current geopolitical landscape. Your technology choices are not independent from your security concerns and economic relationships, and vice versa. Right? Now let's talk about second order effects. Semiconductor controls. So it begins with Western moves, American moves. Western moves to restrict advanced semiconductor exports to China to maintain technological advantage and prevent military applications. So that is the initial action. Now this has a first order effect, immediate effect. The immediate effect of this is that the Japan US Taiwan alliance strengthens around semiconductor security. This creates a more integrated technology security framework. That's the first order effect. Then there is a second order effect. The second order effect is that China responds to this. China responds by weaponizing rare earth exports, which and this obviously is a case of China leveraging its dominance in critical minerals essential for advanced technology manufacturing. That's the second order effect. Now there's a consequence for that also, which is a third order effect. As a consequence of the Chinese actions, Europe and India, they form closer critical minerals partnerships with Australia and the US. They create new supply chains and strategic alignments. And you can go on to fourth order, fifth order, 10th order, nth order effects. This is the chain of causality. This is how you understand geopolitics. Causality, cause and effect. There's an initial action that leads to a first order cause, first order effect, second order effect, third order effect, and this ripples through. This ripples through history. So the takeaway of all of this is that this cascade of events, this is one example I've given you. This cascade of effects, it demonstrates how a single policy decision can trigger multiple rounds of strategic responses across different domains and different regions. Now, once again, let's take another example of second order effects, IAEA expulsions. Right? So the initial action is that Iran has expelled IAEA inspectors, which has and significantly reduced. This has had the effect of significantly reducing international oversight of Iran's nuclear program, and this has created uncertainty about Iran's nuclear activities. I have taken this as the initial action. I could have taken something else as an initial action, but then we can go all the way back to 2000 BC. So I'm starting with this as the initial action. So, because of this initial action, there is a set of consequences. The first order effect: nuclear proliferation fears intensify across the Middle East, particularly in Saudi Arabia and in the UAE, because Iran's nuclear program is now advancing without IAEA monitoring. That's the first order effect. The consequence of that is the second order effect. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, they accelerate their talks on US backed regional missile defense umbrellas to counter this potential perceived future Iranian threat. That's the second order effect. As a consequence of that there's a third order effect. New security pacts reshape regional alliances and potentially draw major powers deeper into Middle Eastern security arrangements. And I could go on and on. So the takeaway from all of this is that this sequence that I've shown you over here on the screen, it illustrates how actions related to nuclear monitoring can quickly escalate into wider, broader regional security realignments with global geopolitical, geostrategic implications. Let's take one more example of second order, third order effects. Tech controls and supply chains. So here the initial action is that the US implements restrictions on AI chip exports to China to maintain US technological advantage and primacy and to prevent military applications emerging in China. That's the initial action that the US has taken. We know this happened. What's the first order effect? China itself ends up promoting a China plus one strategy. China decides to offshore the final assembly to Southeast Asian nations to circumvent tariffs while maintaining control of supply chains. So this is the Chinese response to the initial action by the US. What's the second order effect? China deepens its economic integration with Southeast Asia, creating stronger regional influence and dependencies. President Xi Jinping went on a tour of Southeast Asia recently. So that's the second order effect. China deepens its economic integration in the region. It creates stronger regional influence and dependencies. Then there's a third order effect. The US has to respond now. The US is forced to play whack-a-mole by expanding controls to Malaysia and Thailand. This further fragments the global supply chain, and this potentially will end up alienating America's regional allies or partners. And this will go on. There'll be fourth order effects, fifth order effects, and so on. The takeaway from this is that this cascade of events that I've shown here on the screen, it demonstrates how technological competition can reshape regional economic integration and create complex challenges for policy enforcements. So this is all examples of causality, the cause and effect chain that essentially is the primary shaper and driver of world history. Now let's take a look at some strategic assumptions, confirmation and challenge of strategic assumptions. Let's examine how recent developments in the past week or so have either validated or contradicted key assumptions that we have, key assumptions that underpin geopolitical analysis and strategy. Okay, let's take a look at some of these. First of all, a challenged assumption: Western strategic cohesion. So the assumption has been that Western powers maintain a cohesive strategy on key geopolitical issues and threats. That assumption is being challenged. So the challenges typically are from Russia, China, and other adversaries. What's the evidence that contradicts this assumption? So the US has imposed tariffs on the EU. It's imposed tariffs on Japan and South Korea. And the US, while imposing these harsh tariffs on these nations, it is at the same time expecting security cooperation from these nations. This creates a fundamental contradiction in the Western alliance system, right? The US has sanctioned a UN rapporteur on Gaza. It's a move that the EU is unlikely to support. The UK-France nuclear pact is an explicit hedge against the perceived unreliability of the US security guarantee. So, this assumption that the Western powers maintain a cohesive strategy on key geopolitical threats and present a unified threat, it is clearly being challenged over here. The takeaway is that the evidence suggests that Western powers are pursuing increasingly divergent strategies. This undermines the long standing assumption of a cohesive approach from the West to global challenges. Next, that's a confirmed assumption. Russia, strategic alignment. The assumption is that China views the Ukraine conflict through the lens of its own strategic competition with the United States. And China will prevent or seek to prevent a Russian defeat to maintain a united front against Western power. And we have evidence that confirms this assumption. This assumption is unequivocally confirmed. China has made this explicit statement to the EU that it cannot and will not accept Russia losing in the Ukraine war. This is a critical data point that moves this from an analytical assessment to a stated policy position. And the strategic implication of this is that the China-Russia coalition, axis, alliance, whatever it is a strategically it's a strategic reality, and it's designed to challenge the Western order. It's not merely a temporary alignment of convenience, which kind of flies in the fact of other things we've seen in the past. But the takeaway is that this evidence unequivocally confirms that China has made a strategic decision to support Russia against Western pressure. And this is going to have significant implications for the Ukraine conflict and broader geopolitical competition. And China will at the same time seek to spy on Russia and undermine Russia's long-term geopolitical viability. So, complicated. So, this assumption has been confirmed. And what assumption has been challenged? India's passive non-alignment. The assumption for the longest time has been that India's strategic autonomy is a passive non-aligned posture that seeks to avoid entanglement in great power competition while maintaining relations with all sides. That's the assumption. Lots of Indians also assume this. But the evidence shows that India's policy is evolving into active multi-alignment. India is simultaneously finalizing a trade deal to get an exemption from US tariffs, while India's Prime Minister attends the BRICS summit, where he challenges Chinese dominance over critical minerals. At the same time, India is working with Russia, possibly in considering Russian offers of weapon systems and much more. So this is not passive non-alignment. This is a proactive strategy of engaging with all sides to maximize India's strategic advantage. This is better described as multi-alignment. The takeaway from this is that India is actively leveraging its position between competing blocs to extract concessions and enhance India's global influence. And this represents a more sophisticated approach than traditional non-alignment. Now we finish with the most consequential developments that need immediate attention from policymakers and strategists, because they have the potential for rapid escalation or systemic impact. First of all, there's an imminent Iranian nuclear breakout possibility and widening regional war. There's been the expulsion of IAEA inspectors. Iran has acquired 300 tons of uranium from Niger, and there's confirmation that Iran's enriched uranium stockpile survived US and Israeli strikes. So this creates an immediate and severe risk of Iran breaking out as a nuclear weapons power. And there have been direct Israeli strikes on Houthi targets in Yemen. There have been Iranian attacks, missile attacks in the past on US bases and so on. So the region could be on the brink of a full-scale war that could end up having a nuclear dimension. The takeaway is that this combination of nuclear advancement and military escalation represents the most urgent and dangerous development in the past month, which requires immediate international attention, even from nations like India that may not be directly involved in this at all. Secondly, the US global trade war, tariff implementation, and retaliatory cascade. The cascade, right? So the Trump administration has a plan to impose sweeping tariffs of up to 70% on allies and rivals alike. This represents a systemic shock that the US is deliberately applying to the global economy. And there's a deadline of August 1, which serves as the critical trigger date. The fallout of this will not be merely economic. It's going to actively reshape global alliances. It's going to force supply chain relocations. It's going to accelerate the formation of anti-US economic blocs like the BRICS, like RCEP. And this policy of the Trump administration is the central driver right now of current geopolitical realignment. It could potentially fragment the global economic order into competing blocks. The takeaway is that the implementation of Trump's tariffs could trigger a cascade of retaliatory measures that could fundamentally alter global trade patterns and strategic relationships. And China has formalized its pro-Russia stance. This is a watershed statement. China has said that it cannot accept a Russian defeat in Ukraine. This is a formal strategic commitment by China to Russia. It has immediate implications for the Ukraine war's trajectory. It will potentially prolong the conflict and undermine the effectiveness of Western sanctions against Russia. There's the potential for more direct two-front strategic competition between the US and NATO on one side and a coordinated Russia-China axis on the other side, which is a formalization of what we've always seen coming over the past 3-4 years. The takeaway is that this development requires an immediate reassessment of Western strategy, and also other nation strategy for both Europe and the Indo-Pacific. And this confirms the emergence of a more coordinated challenge to the US-dominated international order. The bottom line is that the world is moving into an even more fractured, multi-vector contest across the domains of technology, security, and economics. Policymakers should prioritize, first of all, stabilizing critical supply chains, particularly semiconductors and rare earths, which are becoming key leverage points in great power competition. Secondly, they need to shore up nuclear verification regimes, strengthen international regimes to prevent proliferation amid growing regional tensions. We don't want new nuclear powers cropping up. It's not good for the world. And thirdly, we need to prepare for proxy conflicts. And policymakers in all major countries need to develop strategies to counter the uptick in hybrid warfare tactics, which is being deployed across multiple regions. The takeaway is that the world is moving into an even more fractured, multi-vector contest across technology, security, and economics. And this requires sophisticated and coordinated policy responses across domains, across multiple domains, across all the domains. So that brings us to the end of today's episode of Geostrategy. I hope it was valuable to you. Please, if you did find it valuable, please like, subscribe, and share. And I will see you in the next live stream, which is tomorrow evening on Ask Abhijit. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you soon.